August 1st, 1914, Germany declares war on Russia. And a sudden feeling of unity came to the divided nation. The Tsar swore he would never make peace while one foreign soldier remained in Mother Russia. The people cheered him. They knelt to receive his blessing, and many of them called him a great father of his people. The patriotic fever, which was shaking every warring nation of Europe, also gripped Russia. An army of 1.5 million was mobilized in the first week of the war. Volunteers on their way to the greatest human slaughter ever known. On the bleak battlefields of Eastern Europe, 1 man out of every 2 was to become a casualty. The dead, often unburied, and the wounded left to freeze in their own blood. At the outbreak of war, the Bolshevik leader Lenin was expelled from Poland and moved to Bern in Switzerland. Here he met with a small group of fellow revolutionaries in a wood near the city. Lenin analyzed the probable consequences of the war in terms of what he advocated, turning what he called an imperialist war into a civil war. But it was still very early in the war, and the only effect of Lenin's urging fell on the Bolshevik members of the National Assembly. They were arrested for opposing the war, convicted of high treason, and exiled to Siberia. Everyone thought Russia's vast armies would steamroller across Europe, but they were poorly equipped and badly led. Hindenburg, the German commander, inflicted a classic defeat on the Russians at Tannenberg in the first month of the war. The Germans cut off and surrounded the Russians. In that 1 month, the Russians suffered 300,000 casualties, taken prisoner, wounded, or dead. The commander-in-chief, the Tsar's cousin, was removed from his post. The Tsar himself took over, but the defeats continued. However, the war minister felt that if commanders were faulty, the soldiers could always place their trust in a higher power. Faith was hardly enough. 1 man in 3 had no rifle. Many hadn't even boots. At the palace of Sarko-Selo, where the empress lived with her children, another and more extraordinary religious influence had arisen. Rasputin, a drunken, uncouth peasant, had an uncanny hold on the empress, who believed that his mystic powers could cure her invalid son. As her favorite, Rasputin had wheedled his way into the highest places. His reputation as a lecher never lessened his magnetic attraction for fashionable women, and the empress was spellbound. Moscow cartoonists, however, saw things differently. Under Rasputin's influence, the empress wrote long and prodding letters to her husband at the front, alternately expressing sympathy for his heavy burden and admonishing him to spend as much time as he could with his troops, which he did. Also, there were a great many wounded to console. The Empress set up her own military hospital near St. Petersburg. The flood of dying and wounded from the front had increased as the Russian army was pushed steadily back by the forces of Hindenburg. and the reversals of war increased the popular feeling against Grigory Rasputin. In December 1916, Rasputin was invited to the house of Prince Yusupov in St. Petersburg. And while his aristocratic friends played Yankee Doodle Dandy on the gramophone, he was murdered. The conspirators bundled his body from the house. They had fed him massive doses of cyanide in cakes and wine. Then they shot him through the heart, shot him again, and battered his head in. Finally, they dumped his body in the river. The Russian winter of 1916 was one of the coldest ever. Transport was disorganized and power supplies were cut. Bread was hard to find because flour was scarce. The lack of consumer goods and inflation made peasants reluctant to sell their grain. Sadly and without enthusiasm, the army shivered its way through the frozen months. After the humiliation of defeat had come the bleak miseries of Russian winter. At home, even the meager war rations failed to get through to the cities, and the people's rumbling discontent erupted into the streets. On February 23rd, there was a general strike in St. Petersburg. Nearly 100,000 workers joined in the demonstrations. Stop the disturbances in the capital, the Tsar ordered, but it made no difference. Four days later, the garrison of the city threw in their lot with the strikers, and most of those who mutinied were regular soldiers. It was the turning point, for without military force, there was no means of restoring order, and the fate of St. Petersburg, of Russia, and of the Tsar was now in the hands of the people. In a desperate search for leadership, the demonstrators marched to the National Assembly. In the same building, a council of workers and soldiers was already sitting, a new Soviet, and from this day it functioned as a rival to the Assembly. Alexander Kerensky, a 35-year-old lawyer, was a member of both the Assembly and the Soviet. He was a gifted orator, and his eloquent appeal for a democratic regime made him a public idol. When the troops at the front heard of the riots in the capital and were told that the Tsar might fall at any moment, they cheered and laughed and waved their banners like everyone else, thinking, no doubt, that a new government might end the war. On March 2nd, 1917, the last of the Romanovs fell. Without even a show of resistance, Nicholas signed the instrument of abdication. The English novelist William Gerhardy comments.
He was very obdurate, and so he had to abdicate. And the members of the Duma boarded his train at the siding, Pskov, and demanded his abdication. And he had to agree. There was nothing else he could do. And what was so tragic was that the official document of abdication contained all his marvelous titles. It began with we, Nikolai II Alexandrovich, a sovereign emperor and autocrat of all the Russias, Tsar of Poland, great prince of Finland and Lithuania, and Tsar of Siberia, Tsar of Pskov, and so it went on, and etc., etc., and ruler and hospodar of many other lands, to all our faithful subjects. But actually he had very few faithful subjects left, and when he left headquarters for the capital, all his courtiers were leaving him surreptitiously. They were sort of dropping off at obscure stations, and he arrived all by himself, and he fell into his consort's arms, weeping, because he felt that he'd been terribly humiliated. And of course nobody wanted the Tsar by then, but he actually said to his consort, he said, now if the whole of Russia went down on its knees to me and asked me to return, I would not do it.
On the day of the abdication, Alexander Kerensky was photographed in the grounds of the royal palace. The leader of a group of middle-class idealists, he was loudly applauded by the masses whose champion he felt himself to be. And he spoke triumphantly of the miracle that had happened, the transformation of slaves into free men. A coalition government was formed of the right and the center. The prime minister was the conservative Prince Lvov, and Kerensky was Minister of Justice. Mobs sacked and looted the old Tsarist offices. They destroyed the police headquarters and stormed the jails. Of more practical value was the release of over 1,000 political prisoners. A young man called Molotov came home from a long Siberian exile. So did another, Stalin, the man of steel. At the outbreak of war, Lenin had taken refuge in Switzerland, and he was now living in Zurich, writing propaganda and keeping in touch with the Bolshevik underground in Russia. When news reached him of the February Rising, he was living above a restaurant in the old quarter of the city. The February Rising surprised him, but he immediately wrote to Russia with plans of action. He decided to leave Switzerland for St. Petersburg and the revolution as soon as possible. When he left for home, Lenin had been away from Russia for over 10 years, and he was traveling with fellow revolutionaries who had spent their years of exile waiting for this moment. They crossed Germany in a private train, and their safe passage was guaranteed by the Kaiser. The German government saw an obvious advantage in helping those who were so violently opposed to Russia's being in the war. From Germany, the exiles took the Baltic ferry to Trelleborg in Sweden, and then on to Stockholm. There was just time for Lenin to stop for a new pair of shoes, and for someone to take this photograph, a group of revolutionaries hurrying to catch up with the revolution. Then they rushed north again through Finland. At last, on April 3rd, 1917, the long exile was over. 8 days after leaving Switzerland and 6 weeks after the February Rising, Lenin arrived at St. Petersburg. A large crowd met him at the station, and many of them must have expected him to congratulate them on a revolution they believed was won. But for Lenin, the real revolution was still in the future. The day after his return to Russia, Lenin addressed the Soviet in the Tauride Palace, and he surprised his audience with a bitter attack on the government. He claimed that most of the Russian Social Democrats had betrayed socialism, that in order to build the world over again, the workers and the poverty-stricken peasants had to take power. had to bring about the greatest workers' revolution in human history. It is time, he said, to cast off the old dirty shirt and put on a new one. 4 weeks later, Leon Trotsky arrived from New York. For the past 12 years, he and others had opposed Lenin on some issues, supported him on some. In August, he joined the party, and his brilliance as orator and organizer were to make him the second party chief. For a time, the new government seemed to be losing ground. At the end of April 1917, 30,000 soldiers and most of the civilian population of St. Petersburg marched with slogans opposing the war. On May Day, the demonstration continued. The people were enjoying a newly won freedom of speech, and now they used it to call for the overthrow of the government which had granted it. On the battlefields, the Bolshevik peace slogans had immediate appeal. They sent agitators among the troops, and sometimes even persuaded them that the enemy soldiers were really their brothers. The government, unnerved by army mutinies, made Kerensky Minister of War. Calling for confidence and discipline from the troops, he assured the Allies that Russia would continue to fight. An American delegation welcomed this assurance. The British also came and were duly impressed when Kerensky told them that anti-Bolshevik demonstrations were taking place in the capital, with banners which said, "Russia is not a frog for the experiments of Lenin." How wrong that statement was.